Unfortunately, the Obama administration has jettisoned this policy by withholding Israel's access to the advanced defense equipment required to deter and, if necessary, defeat any adversary. This must change. Instead of putting even more pressure on Israel, we should do everything to make Israel feel safe. Third, Israel wants peace with the Palestinians, and the U.S. should support efforts by the two parties to make peace through face-to-face negotiations. We should actively support pragmatic efforts to build Palestinian institutions in the West Bank so that Palestinian self-rule becomes possible without imposing unacceptable risks for Israel's security. However, rather than focus on defending the security of Israel, this president is rolling the dice on his theory that an intensive focus on the Mideast process will somehow resolve every other issue in the region. He, Secretary Clinton, and other members of the administration insist on putting the cart before the horse and believing a solution will lead to greater acceptance of Israel around the world, that it will force the Palestinians to run a proper society, that it will lead to a waning of extremism. However, these results are actually the preconditions or the conditions that are needed to reach a solution in the first place. So long as other governments mercilessly criticize Israel, so long as the Palestinians ignore the problems of their own society and blame everything on Israel, and so long as Palestinian extremists are emboldened by extremists' forces across the region, a two-state solution almost certainly cannot happen. The U.S. should seek to alleviate these larger problems in order to make Israeli-Palestinian peace possible, not the other way around. Before demanding Israeli withdrawals in the West Bank, the U.S. should recall the lessons of South Lebanon and Gaza, where after Israeli withdrawal, these areas became terrorist bases, not the basis for peace. And we should always remember that the obstacle to peace is not Israel. It is a Palestinian extremist and Islamic terrorists who will not accept the Jewish state. In working towards a solution, we should assist the Palestinians and Israelis in reaching agreements and encourage other Arab parties to normalize with Israel and back those Palestinian interests committed to peace with Israel. Fourth, Jerusalem is Israel's capital. It is something the U.S. Congress has repeatedly recognized. The U.S. should work towards the goal of moving our embassy there. We should stop condemning or punishing Israel for allowing Jews to build homes in their capital city, one to which Jews have a historic and religious attachment. Fifth, construction activity in the West Bank settlements has never before prevented negotiations, and a construction freeze should not be a precondition for them. Israel has shown in Sinai, Gaza, and the West Bank the willingness to remove settlements and their inhabitants. The government of Israel has, under several prime ministers, made it clear its understanding that a negotiated agreement with the Palestinians may require removal of many West Bank settlements. The U.S. must continue to support the position expressed by President Bush in a 2004 letter to Prime Minister Sharon, which stated that there would be no return to the 1949 armistice lines and that those lines would have to be adjusted to reflect changes on the ground since 1967. Major new settlements where thousands of Israeli families now live. While years of negotiations continue, those families must be allowed some semblance of normality in their lives. The sixth area of concern with U.S.-Israel foreign policy relates to our actions at international bodies like the United Nations. In recent weeks, tensions have heightened in the Middle East, with a confrontation provoked by the Turkish flotilla. It was outrageous for the United States to abandon Israel at the UN and support a Security Council statement condemning the acts that led to bloodshed, including Israel's need to defend itself. There will be worldwide consequences if the United States continues to pressure Israel to lift its legal and necessary blockade of Gaza. Iran and its terrorist surrogates are the only ones who will benefit. A unilateral collapse of the Gaza blockade will make a new war much more likely. Weapons will pour into the hands of Hamas. Israel will be forced to react with military force. The Palestinians and world opinion will become even more radicalized. The world will turn even further away from a two-state solution in favor of pressuring Israel into simply giving up on its own security. It is also important to highlight the outrageous actions of the Obama administration in supporting the UN resolution passed at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Conference just 3 days before the flotilla incident. President Obama, in his quest for a world free of nuclear weapons, has increasingly lumped Israel together with other countries outside of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, such as North Korea, India, and Pakistan. I am deeply concerned that the U.S. chose to support a UN resolution that undermines Israel's security while giving Iran a free pass. Americans simply do not want to hand over our security to multinational institutions where anti-American majorities rule, nor can we allow Israel's legitimacy and credibility to be undermined in any way by these international bodies. And finally, I want to focus on the single greatest threat to Israel, to America, and the security of the entire world. It is a belligerent Iran with its nuclear program and its aggressive support for terrorism. A nuclear Iran poses a grave threat to its neighbors and to the world alike. Iran has been a leading state sponsor of global terrorism. It has funded and armed Hezbollah and Hamas. It has supported our enemies in Iraq with weapons that have killed and wounded American soldiers. U.S. troops have also uncovered Iranian-produced IED devices in Afghanistan. Its president has repeatedly denied the Holocaust and pledged to exterminate Israel. And in the aftermath of its recent election, the Iranian regime showed no restraint in unleashing its aggression on its own people, murdering peaceful demonstrators protesting an illegitimate election result. In the past 18 months, Iran has produced more enriched uranium than it did the previous 30 years, enough to produce at least 2 nuclear weapons. Why? Here's the bottom line. Iran is committed to building a bomb. They believe that a nuclear capacity will convert them into the supreme regional power and gain them leverage on America and the world. And even worse, it actually gives them the ability to carry out the threat to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. A nuclear Iran would be devastating. Suddenly, Islamic terrorist organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al-Qaeda would have a willing supplier for nuclear weapons to use against Israel, the United States, and any so-called unbelievers who stand in their way of establishing a global Islamic caliphate. We all hope that the United Nations will impose crippling sanctions on Iran. But for all its strongly worded condemnation, the UN sanctions imposed yesterday are impotent because they allow Russia to sell the S-300 anti-aircraft missile system to Iran, a system Iran wants for one reason alone: to shoot down Israeli and American warplanes. The time has come for the United States, for Israel, and every other willing nation on earth to come together to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. This should include efforts to pursue strong economic sanctions against foreign companies that transport, finance, or broker in any way or facilitate the export of refined petroleum products, including gasoline and diesel fuel, to Iran. In fact, there are things that the U.S. can do unilaterally to set an example. As the Speaker of the Florida House, I, along with Representative Bogdanoff, Representative Hasner, and many others across the state of Florida, supported legislation to require Florida's pension fund to divest from companies doing business with Iran and Sudan. That made us the first state in the country to do so. Building on this effort, I believe Congress should swiftly approve the Iran Refined Petroleum Sanctions Act. Of course, the ideal solution to Iran's nuclear weapons programs, and ultimately to many of the region's problems, lies in a process of democratic change in Iran that sends the Islamic revolution of Ayatollah Khomeini back to the dustbin of history, where it belongs.